You noticed it first in a photograph, not in the mirror, because the mirror shows you the angle you choose. The photograph showed you the angle you did not. The crown, lit from above, a circle of scalp visible through hair that you had not registered as thinning until you saw it from that distance, in that light, through someone else's lens. You went back to the mirror. You tilted your head. You moved your phone flashlight. And once you had seen it, you could not stop seeing it. You began tracking it against older photographs, trying to remember when the part line had been that wide, when the temples had started to pull back that far, when the density at the crown had gone from full to thin to something approaching visible scalp. You searched. Everyone told you the same story. It runs in the family. The follicles on top are sensitive to hormones. The hair dies. Some treatments slow it. There is no structural reason for the pattern. That last sentence is the one I want to take apart. Because the pattern is not random. The horseshoe shape appearing on millions of men's scalps across every ethnicity, every continent, every diet and climate and lifestyle, with identical geography every single time, top gone, sides preserved, follows the outline of a specific anatomical structure beneath the scalp that most explanations never mention. The pattern is a map. Maps have geography, and once you understand what the geography is, the question changes from why is this happening to why is it happening there and not here. Identical hormones, identical genes in every follicle, completely different outcomes separated by less than 10 centimeters on the same scalp. That is not a genetic story. That is an anatomical one. What I am going to walk you through is the full mechanism, not just the hormone, but the structure the hormone interacts with and why that structure determines the geography of the pattern. And the piece at the end that most explanations stop before reaching. Why the follicle under there is not dead, and what that means for the window that still exists. Start with what the hair on your shower drain actually is. The follicle that produced it is still in your scalp, still embedded in the dermal tissue, still connected to the blood supply, still cycling. It did not die. What that follicle is producing now is different from what it produced 5 years ago. But the follicle is present, active, running through its cycle on an independent clock, exactly as it was designed to. Every scalp follicle operates on a three-phase clock. Anagen, the growth phase, runs for 2 to 7 years. During anagen, the matrix cells at the base divide rapidly, producing the keratin that forms the hair shaft and pushing it upward at roughly 1 centimeter per month. Anagen duration determines the maximum length your hair can reach. The length ceiling is a property of the clock, not the hair. Catagen, the regression phase, lasts 2 to 3 weeks. The matrix cells stop dividing. The lower follicle contracts toward the skin surface. The hair shaft detaches from its blood supply and becomes a club hair anchored loosely in the upper follicle. Telogen, the resting phase, lasts approximately 3 months. When the new cycle begins, the new hair growing beneath pushes the old club hair out. That hair on the pillow was a telogen club hair, a shaft that completed its full cycle and was displaced by its successor. At any given moment, 85 to 90% of scalp follicles are in anagen, 10 to 15% in telogen. You shed 50 to 100 telogen hairs per day as normal turnover. Each shed hair already replaced by a growing successor. This is not hair loss, this is hair replacement. Hair loss begins when the clock changes. In pattern baldness, the anagen phase shortens with each successive cycle. A follicle that ran a 5-year anagen phase in your 20s runs 3 years in your 30s, then 18 months, then weeks. Each shorter cycle produces a shorter, thinner hair, and with each shortened cycle, the follicle itself physically shrinks. The dermal papilla, the cluster of specialized cells at the very base of the follicle that determines everything about the hair produced, its thickness, length, pigmentation, and growth rate, become smaller with each round. A large papilla with a robust capillary network delivering oxygen, glucose, and growth signals to the matrix cells above produces thick, deeply pigmented terminal hair. A small papilla with a compromised blood supply produces thin, unpigmented vellus hair. A papilla that has lost 60% of its volume produces a hair shaft with proportionally reduced diameter. Terminal hair becomes intermediate. Intermediate becomes vellus, the near invisible peach fuzz that covers a child's forehead. That is what the bald scalp is producing, not nothing. Vellus hair too fine to see from standing distance, produced by follicles that are alive, cycling, and structurally present. Hair transplant surgery demonstrates this from the opposite direction. Follicles removed from the sides and back and transplanted to the thinning top continue producing thick terminal hair in their new location for life. The follicle carries its original characteristics regardless of where it is placed. That observation raises the question the standard explanation does not fully answer. Testosterone circulates to every follicle on the scalp at roughly equal concentrations across every region. At the follicle, an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase converts testosterone into dihydrotestosterone. DHT binds to androgen receptors on the dermal papilla cells with 5 times the affinity of testosterone, triggering the downstream changes that shorten the anagen phase and begin miniaturization. The conversion is local at the follicle itself. The concentration of DHT each follicle experiences depends on 2 factors: how much is produced locally and how quickly the local blood supply removes it. That second factor is the one the standard explanation moves past quickly. 5-alpha reductase is present in follicles across the entire scalp, crown, temples, sides, back. DHT is produced everywhere through the identical enzymatic conversion in every region. Both the thinning regions and the permanent regions have androgen receptors. Both produce DHT. Both are exposed to identical circulating testosterone. Why does miniaturization occur only at the top, crown, and temples, and never at the sides and back? The established explanation is differential androgen receptor sensitivity. The follicles on top are genetically programmed to respond more strongly to DHT. This model is supported by decades of research and accurately describes the hormonal mechanism. What it does not address is why follicles developed from identical embryonic tissue, carrying identical DNA in every cell, would express different receptor sensitivity based solely on geographic position on the same scalp. Identical genome, identical hormone, different outcome, determined entirely by location. Something about the local environment on top differs from the local environment on the sides. The hormone is identical in both regions. The difference must be structural. Every man who has looked at the horseshoe pattern in the mirror has been looking at a map. Maps require geography. And while the hormone is the trigger, the geography is the question. Beneath your scalp, spanning the top of the skull, is a structure called the Gallia aponeurotica, a dense, fibrous, inelastic sheet of connective tissue stretching from the frontalis muscle at the forehead to the occipitalis at the base of the skull and laterally to the temporalis muscles above the ears. The gallia is a tendinous bridge between these muscles. When you raise your eyebrows, the frontalis pulls the gallia forward. When you tense the back of your scalp, the occipitalis pulls it rearward. Chronic resting tension in these muscles keeps the gallia taut even when you are not actively moving your scalp. It is a biological helmet of tough fascia, thinner than a credit card and resistant to stretching. The collagen fibers are arranged in a cross-hatched pattern that withstands the pulling forces of the scalp muscles without deforming. The blood vessels supplying the follicles on the top of the skull must pass through this taut sheet. The arteries penetrate the gallia through small openings in the fascia, compressed by the surrounding tissue as they transit. You can feel the difference yourself. If you have access to your own scalp, This demonstration takes 10 seconds. Press your fingertips on the top of your head over the crown and try to slide the scalp over the bone beneath. The scalp barely moves, 2 or 3 millimeters in any direction before the galea reaches its limit and the resistance becomes absolute. Now press your fingertips on the side of your head, above the ear, where the temporalis muscle sits beneath loose connective tissue. Slide the scalp. It moves freely, a centimeter or more in any direction. The tissue elastic and mobile under your fingers. Two regions separated by less than 10 centimeters on your own scalp with fundamentally different mechanical properties. The follicles in each region inhabit those different environments for the entirety of your life. Now look at the pattern. Hair thins and eventually disappears on the top, the crown, and the temples, exactly where the galea stretches tightest over the skull. Hair remains thick and permanent on the sides and back, exactly where the galea is absent, and the scalp tissue is loose, well perfused, and mobile. The baldness map and the galea map are anatomically identical. The evening I pressed my fingertips against my own crown and then against the tissue above my ear and felt the taut resistance give way to free mobility in a distance of centimeters, the correlation between what my fingers felt and where the thinning had occurred was immediate. The geography was not arbitrary. It followed the exact outline of the structure I was pressing against. Choi and colleagues published in Archives of Dermatological Research in 2020 proposing the mechanical hypothesis. Chronic galea tension compresses the blood vessels supplying the follicles in the galea-covered region. Reduced perfusion means reduced clearance of locally produced DHT. The hormone is produced at every follicle through the standard enzymatic pathway, but the blood flow that would carry DHT away is restricted by the compressed vasculature. DHT accumulates to higher local concentrations under the galea, not because more is produced there, because less is removed. The regional difference in DHT exposure, created by the regional difference in blood flow, drives the regional difference in miniaturization rate. This hypothesis is not mainstream consensus. The established model attributes the geographic pattern to intrinsic genetic differences in receptor sensitivity between follicle populations, and that model has substantial evidence behind it. What the mechanical hypothesis adds is an explanation for how genetically similar follicles might develop different receptor sensitivity over time. Chronic exposure to higher local DHT concentrations gradually upregulating receptor expression in the affected follicles, creating the sensitivity difference the standard model observes as an endpoint rather than a starting point. Scalp blood flow is measurably lower in galea-covered regions than in galea-free regions in every study that has measured it. The full causal chain awaits confirmation through intervention trials. The physics is consistent with the anatomy and the perfusion data. It is the mechanical layer beneath the hormonal one. What the restricted blood flow initiates next explains why the loss accelerates over time. Local tissue hypoxia triggers an inflammatory response. Chronic low-grade perifollicular inflammation, visible on scalp biopsies in the majority of men with pattern hair loss, that does not resolve because the cause, restricted blood flow through the compressed galea, does not resolve. Chronic inflammation triggers fibrosis, the deposition of dense collagen around the follicle, replacing normal soft connective tissue with scar-like material that is less elastic, less permeable to blood vessels, and progressively more compressive. Fibrosis makes the miniaturization self-reinforcing. Reduced blood flow triggers inflammation. Inflammation triggers collagen deposition. The collagen further compresses the follicle and its remaining blood supply. Less oxygen triggers more inflammation, which deposits more collagen, which tightens the compression another increment. Each revolution narrows the space the follicle occupies, measurable in the progressive thickening of the perifollicular collagen sheath on sequential scalp biopsies. Garza and colleagues identified in Science Translational Medicine in 2012 that prostaglandin D2, a lipid mediator of inflammation, is elevated in bald scalp tissue compared to haired scalp. The inflammation marker correlates with follicle size. The more miniaturized the follicle, the higher the local concentration. The inflammatory burden increases as the fibrosis progresses. The follicle that began with mild perfusion reduction ends, after years of this loop, encased in dense fibrotic tissue that restricts blood flow regardless of systemic health. The follicle is not dead, it is strangled. Not by the hormone alone, but by the inflammatory response restricted blood flow created, and the compression that fibrosis now maintains. The dermal papilla is mechanosensitive. It responds to mechanical signals from its environment through the same transduction pathways bone cells use to detect loading and muscle fibers use to detect contraction. Mechanotransduction is the conversion of a mechanical input into a biochemical signal. The dermal papilla uses it to calibrate growth output to the environment the follicle inhabits. When blood flow is adequate and the surrounding tissue mobile, the growth signals are strong. When blood flow is restricted and the tissue rigid under a taut gallia and progressive fibrosis, the signals weaken and the anagen phase shortens with each cycle. Koyama and colleagues demonstrated in ePlasty in 2019 that 4 minutes of daily scalp massage increased hair thickness in participants with androgenetic hair loss. Mechanical force applied through the fingertips stretches the dermal papilla cells, activating WNT beta-catenin signaling, the pathway that drives follicle stem cell activation and promotes the transition from telogen back into anagen. The mechanism operates through three simultaneous effects. First, the stretching of the galea temporarily reduces compressive tension on the blood vessels passing through it, increasing perfusion and improving both oxygen delivery and DHT clearance from the tissue. Second, the physical stretching of the papilla cells deforms their cytoskeleton, initiating the WNT beta-catenin cascade directly without chemical intervention. Third, sustained mechanical input gradually loosens the collagen adhesions that have been tightening around the follicle with each inflammatory cycle. Hair thickness increased measurably after 24 weeks. 6 months of consistent input producing changes in follicles that had been miniaturizing for years. The window for that intervention is not unlimited. A follicle in early miniaturization, still producing visible hair, the part line widening but the scalp not yet exposed, the dermal papilla retaining most of its original volume, the capillary network partially intact, responds to mechanical input because the papilla's mechanotransduction pathways are functional and the surrounding tissue is soft enough to mobilize. Early miniaturization is thinning. Thinning is responsive. Advanced miniaturization is different. A follicle producing only vellus hair for years, the dermal papilla severely atrophied, the perifollicular tissue replaced by dense fibrotic collagen, the fibrosis too dense to mobilize with fingertip pressure, the papilla too small to generate meaningful growth signals even if the mechanical input reaches it. The stem cells survive, but the infrastructure supporting their activation has been too thoroughly degraded. That spectrum is why I began 4 minutes every morning at the first sign of thinning, rather than waiting until the pattern was established. Not as vanity, as mechanotransduction, delivering the input the dermal papilla requires through the same physics that maintains every other mechanosensitive tissue in the body. The window is widest when the miniaturization is earliest, when the part line is widening, but the scalp is not yet exposed, when the temples are thinning, but the follicles still retain enough papilla volume and vascular supply to respond. Anyone concerned about the pattern should discuss it with a dermatologist. The hormonal, genetic, and nutritional dimensions extend beyond what the mechanical analysis covers. Every follicle under the galea is alive. They were not switched off by aging. They were not killed by the hormone. They were progressively strangled by a mechanical structure that compressed the supply line feeding them, triggering an inflammatory cascade that deposited fibrosis around them, tightening the strangulation with each passing year until the papilla could no longer produce a hair visible to the naked eye. The follicle is still there, the cycle is still running, the output became invisible. The miniaturization was strangulation, not death. The Gallia created the environment, restricted perfusion, elevated local DHT, mechanical rigidity. The follicles responded to that environment by reducing their output cycle by cycle until it became invisible. The map was never random, it was anatomy.